Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take another look at the most recent entry to the Mafia series, Mafia Definitive Edition, and see how it stacks up to the fan favorite, Mafia II. Now, before we get started, there's a few things that I think are important to keep in mind. First, Mafia Definitive Edition, which released in September of 2020, is a top-to-bottom remake of the original Mafia game that released back in 2002. As such, a lot of the gameplay mechanics and features that I'm going to cover were likely not introduced into this remake on purpose, in order to stay as loyal as possible to the source material. There's of course some caveats to this, as some things have been added while other features have been removed. But for the most part, it's still trying to stay within its own boundaries to deliver a faithful reimagining. Mafia II, on the other hand, released back in 2010, and despite its age, it holds up relatively well. It too received a definitive edition release last year. However, as we explored in that comparison, the changes were minimal, and in some cases, not always beneficial. It's for this reason that I'll be using the two different versions of Mafia II interchangeably throughout this video, and we'll explain differences on a per-situation basis. As always, all games in this comparison will be played on the PC platform, with their graphic settings cranked up to their highest values at a native 4K resolution. And settings like motion blur and chromatic aberration will be disabled to provide cleaner images to compare. Also, if you haven't already heard, I am planning on releasing a big documentary that covers the entirety of the Mafia game series by the end of this month. So be sure to subscribe to the channel and set up your alerts so you're the first one to catch it when it goes live. Alright, so let's kick this comparison off by first taking a look at some of our character models, starting with the lead protagonists, Tommy Angelo from Mafia I and Vito Scaletta from Mafia II. As expected, the most recent title in the series, the remake of Mafia I, has a visual advantage here. Tommy's character model is far more convincing than the model used for Vito, with more polygons, higher fidelity facial textures, and implementation of better subsurface scattering, allowing light to react properly with the surface of his skin. As we've discussed before, the face models for Vito in Mafia II Definitive Edition are an improvement over the original. But even so, Vito still looks like a plastic doll by comparison, with some rough geometry, lifeless eyes, and really stiff animation work. It looked fine for its time, and I'd argue it still holds up nicely on its own. But when stacked up against the likes of last year's Mafia Remake, the difference is plain to see. This is the same case with all the various characters throughout both games, with far superior model designs and texture quality in the Mafia Remake than any of the models seen in Mafia II. However, Mafia II does surprisingly maintain an advantage when it comes to its randomly generated NPCs. Up close, neither game really has the best looking pedestrian models, which is typical of an open world game of this scale. But Mafia Definitive Edition seems to suffer from a lot of the same problems visible in Mafia III, where the character draw distance is extremely short, causing a lot of the character models to look almost broken unless viewed directly in front of the player. Since Mafia II was built on a different engine, this issue doesn't present itself. And while the models aren't necessarily fantastic, they at least have a good amount of detail whenever they're visible on the player's screen. Moving on, let's talk about the environments in both games. Despite the old-timey feel in both titles, they do take place at different points in American history, resulting in some fundamental differences in the look and feel of the playable space. Mafia Definitive Edition takes place during the 1930s, in a fictional city called Lost Heaven, as a sort of combination of various Prohibition-era American cities like Chicago, New York, and San Francisco. Because of this, you'll find a lot of period-appropriate detail like specific architecture, clothing styles, storefronts, and of course, plenty of era-appropriate cars, including old Cadillacs, Pontiacs, and Ford V8s. It's a beautiful-looking game world, though it does lack the type of interactivity you'd expect from a world of this scale. Mafia II, on the other hand, takes place in both the 1940s and 1950s, in a fictional city called Empire Bay, a sort of recreation of post-war New York City, among other American cities from that same era. To account for this slightly newer setting, the playable space offers a different look and feel. The game starts off with some similar aspects, like a lot of the same vehicles and clothing styles, only now it's wintertime, and thick snow blankets the city, and even sits on top of cars before they're driven around a bit. After the first few chapters, the game fast-forwards to the summer of 1951, resulting in a huge change in the NPC's clothing, the cars on the road, and even the songs on the radio. It's much brighter and vibrant than anything we've seen in Mafia I, though this is consistent with the atmosphere that both games are trying to convey. Because of this, it's difficult to really say one game does this better than the other. What can be said though is that Mafia II does a much better job with immersing the players into its world. Players can venture into select storefronts to shop for things like suits, guns, or food, and they can even pull out a gun and rob them, with lots of great attention to detail to accompany these mechanics, like police that will come and investigate the crime scene and even put up yellow tape on the doors. The Mafia Remake doesn't offer this same level of immersion. There's no clothing stores or gun shops to visit. But as I mentioned before, this isn't necessarily a limitation in the developer's imagination, but rather a decision made in order to make the game play like its original source material. As far as the actual quality of things like textures and vehicle models go, Mafia Definitive Edition does have a comfortable lead here, with higher res texture maps for things like walls, roads, and sidewalks, along with much more impressive vehicle model designs, assisted further by the improvements made to the lighting. Lighting is probably where the Mafia Remake excels the most between these two titles. The lighting in Mafia II, including its remaster release, feels very outdated when compared to the lighting we're used to seeing in games today. Not only is the lighting static and dependent on the specific chapter you're playing, but it just has a very unnatural look and feel. Dark interior spaces always feel like they're being lit by some imaginary light source, and exterior environments just have this very cartoony look to them, especially during the 1950s era. There's also no sign of any advanced reflection effects like screen space reflections, though there are a few rare instances of planar reflections in the interiors like with this mirror. When looking at the Mafia Remake, the difference is pretty apparent. The game's coloration appears much more naturally, albeit with lots of earthy tones to try and mimic the older time period. And things like God Ray implementation, global illumination, and screen space reflections help to give it a very updated, modern look. The shadow quality is another area where I think the remake does a better job. The shadows in Mafia II don't necessarily look bad, but there's a fair amount of dithering with the player's shadow projection. And there's also a lot of annoying artifacting issues that are now present in the remaster that seem to be a direct result of how the shadows are being processed. But they otherwise hold up relatively well to the shadows in the Mafia Remake. Environmental shadows like trees look roughly the same, with the only real differences being more attributed to the way the lighting works, giving shadows in the remake a much softer, more believable appearance. Then we get to the effects. Here's an area where I think the Definitive Edition struggles a bit. One of the reasons Mafia II holds up so well from a technical standpoint some 10 years later is that its visual effects are still some of the very best out there. Things like explosions, physics-based destruction, and this cloth simulation look phenomenal and rival even modern games today. The Mafia Remake does offer some nice effects, especially this fantastic fire propagation effect with burning vehicles that will actually slowly eat away at the metal as the car burns. But the flames that make up this fire feel a bit less impressive. It's strange too, because the fire effects in things like barrels actually look better than the flames in Mafia II, especially with the increase to the particle effects. But car explosions in general just feel like a step down overall. Other effects like destruction and cloth simulation again are no match for the likes of Mafia II. There's so much great destruction throughout the course of this game's campaign that still looks great to this day, with pieces of wood breaking apart, glass windows being shattered in several distinct pieces, and tons of physics-based debris pouring out from bullet ricochets in interior spaces. Mafia Definitive Edition has some of this, but it doesn't quite live up to its predecessor. Finally, let's wrap up with a brief sound comparison. Which game do you think has the superior audio quality and design? And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, I think Mafia II manages to hold up pretty well to the most recent entry to the series. Sure, the animations are stiff, the lighting is unnatural, and there's a lot of annoying bugs in the recent Definitive Edition release that have still yet to be fixed. But it's still a remarkably good-looking game considering it's over a decade old. The latest Mafia Remake, on the other hand, is easily the best-looking entry to the series by far, with more advanced character model designs, superior environmental quality, and much better lighting effects. Unfortunately, because it's tied so heavily to the original version of Mafia, the amount of world interactivity is lacking, especially when compared to the likes of Mafia II. But the return of features like cops that will pull you over and give you a ticket is a good sign that any future entries to the Mafia series may be on the right track to deliver one of the best mobster-style games ever made. But what do you guys think? Do you prefer Mafia Definitive Edition's visual design, or are you more partial to Mafia 2's higher level of environmental interactivity? Let me know in the comments section. And don't forget to like and subscribe for my upcoming Mafia documentary coming next week.